So one of the theories I have in Bitcoin is that if you actually sat the average person down and showed them characteristics of our monetary system and characteristics about Bitcoin without any mention of dollar or Bitcoin on there, my estimations would be that about 99% of people would choose Bitcoin. But there's a reason why there's such a negative connotation around Bitcoin. And it's been about 16 years since the first Bitcoin block was mined back in 2009. And from then, we've had 16 years straight of negative marketing around Bitcoin by the media, by governments, by banks, and the people who fund these entities who do not want Bitcoin to succeed. And one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is that nobody can stop Bitcoin. So all they can do is try to throw things at it, throw FUD at it, throw lies, misinformation, everything that they can. And for the people who haven't spent any sort of time in Bitcoin, they hear these things, and that's kind of how they form their opinion around it. So an example of that would be back in 2017, I believe it was, the World Economic Forum came out with this article saying that if we don't stop Bitcoin right now, by 2020, the world's going to run out of energy. That's how energy intensive this Bitcoin network is. We need to be very concerned and worried and shut this thing down before we lose all the energy and power on Earth. And it is now 5 years later, February 2025. And I don't know, my lights are still on in here. Some sunlight back there, but the lights are indeed still on. So we haven't run out of energy yet, but this is just a theme and a trend from the mainstream, from the governments, from the banks who don't want Bitcoin to succeed. So I figured I would just do a little bit of a comparison today, a bit of a breakdown. And I want to do a blind taste test here. And I actually want to use Coca-Cola as an example because I'm pretty sure people out there who have seen, the taste test where you have a drink, 2 drinks in front of you, you put a blindfold on, and then you taste both drinks, and you decide which one's better without carrying any of the marketing or anything else around with it. You make a decision strictly based on the taste. And so I want to do something similar here with Bitcoin and the dollar, where we're going to look at we're going to look at a graphic here. We're going to look at 2 different things. You can decide which one you think you'd rather be using today and in the future. Which one do you think is a better currency? And just like Coca-Cola, we'll use an example here where Coca-Cola is kind of the standard. It's the one that people recognize, people know. But what if there was a better Coca-Cola that we haven't necessarily heard of? We haven't tried before. We don't know anything about it yet. So you have 2 right beside each other here, and you take one, and maybe you like the non-Coke one better. But because we've had so many years of marketing ads and seeing Coca-Cola, and it's just a very familiar brand, people would say, oh, this one's actually better. I just had never heard of it before. I didn't know what this was. So that's what I want to kind of demonstrate here in terms of Bitcoin and the dollar without having those words on this graphic here. So let's take a look at this. This is very, even for me going through this exercise, it was very eye-opening to see the differences here. Actually, before I bring this up, I should give a little shout out here because this was an original chat, an original discussion we had over on Maple Bitcoin here. And we did about a 20-minute video talking about, no, it was half an hour, a really good deep dive comparing fiat to Bitcoin. So if you get some time afterwards, go check it out. It's from Rajat, Forrest, myself. We got Maple Bitcoin here. Let me see if right here. So you should be able to find this. I'll put a link in the description here. But the original conversation around this fiat versus Bitcoin and calling the US dollar the original scam coin or the shit coin, as people call them, you can find it right here for Trade Your Dollars for Bitcoin. It says fiat is a scam. So it's half an hour. We go into a couple different areas of this, but this is where this comparison came from, was from a discussion I did with Rajat and Forrest. So make sure you go check that out. You can just search it in YouTube, type in the @ symbol, Maple Bitcoin, or I'll leave a link in the description here. But anyways, let's get to the spreadsheet here. So I hope you can see this. I'm going to move it down just a little bit. But let's start at the top here with circulating supply. So how many units? How many units are out there in circulation right now? So the first column here We'll just call this number 1, currency 1. And we'll call this one currency 2. No name, nothing. We'll even center these and bold them so everybody can see. So currency 1 is a circulating supply of 27 trillion with a T. And you may have heard me say this before, but there's a pretty big difference between a million and a trillion. There's a pretty big difference between a million and a billion. And basically the difference there between a million and a billion is a billion. That's pretty much the difference. And the difference between a billion and a trillion is essentially a trillion. So we're talking very large numbers here. 27 trillion in circulation for currency number 1. A lot of units. Currency 2 has 19.7 million units. And this is, keep in mind here that this is what we know of. So currency number 1, we actually don't know for sure if that's how much exists out there. That's kind of what we've been told. But the people who create currency number 1, they've been around for about 111 years now, and they haven't been audited one time in history. So that's a pretty important aspect of this too, is the verifiable aspect. Whereas this one, 19.7, you could verify yourself by looking at the ledger. You could log onto a website. You could see that this is, in fact, how many are in circulation today. So the next one here is supply cap. How many of these units can exist over time? So with currency number 1, there is no supply. It's unlimited. Currency number 2, there's a 21 million fixed supply cap. So there will never be more than 21 million of these units that exist. Next one here, nodes. So a node is basically just somebody who has a copy of the ledger. Let's just use that. A node is somebody who has a copy of this ledger. So with currency number 1, some people will tell you that it's 1. There's 1 node, but I'll say there's less than 10, just for being a little bit conservative here. With currency number 2, there's 21,000 or more than that now actually, but 21,000 and growing. And these 21,000 are all geographically dispersed. These 10 or below are all very concentrated geographically. Distribution. So how much are we creating here? And how many of these currencies, who holds them right now? So the distribution of it, so 1% of the population owns 30% of the supply of currency number 1. And individuals, people like me, people like you, we own 70% of currency number 2. So it's about the same, I would say. About the same in terms of distribution. Although I think even with the distribution of currency number 2, the 1% would own about, let's say 5%. So that this one's about equal, but still in favor of currency number 2 here. In the last 6 months, how much was created? So for currency number 1, we've created 25% in the last 6 months of the total supply has been created in the last 6 months. And if you want to go even further, take it the last 4 years. It's about 40% increase in the last 4 years of currency number 1. Currency number 2, it's about 2% increase now. It's actually, currency number 2 has a lower inflation rate than gold, which was historically the most scarce asset that existed before. But in 2024, currency number 2 actually passed gold for the lowest inflation rate. So this is actually below 2%. And the beautiful thing about this, this is new supply per day, and this is also new supply in the last 6 months, is one's growing and one's shrinking. So this currency number 1 can only go up. The more, we just have to keep printing more and more of it. It's only going one direction, and that's more. This one's actually going down. So in 4 years from now, there'll be less supply coming onto the market every day than there is today. So they're moving in different directions. One of them, currency number 1, is increasing in supply, whereas currency number 2 is actually decreasing in new supply. So this one's per day, new supply per day. This one, currency number 1, is about 38 million per day of new units created. 38 million. Currency number 2 has 450 new units per day created. The annual return, and I know most people think that currency number 1 is about 0%. It's very stable, as most people know it. But it's actually, in real terms, it's negative 3% every year. You're losing just by holding that one. With currency number 2, it's returned about 60% over the last 10 years per year on average. Some years much higher, some years it crashes, but on average, if you hold it for at least 4 years, you're going to be getting about a 60% annual return just by holding on to it. In case of a blackout, everybody always worries. What happens if the power goes out? What happens if we have a blackout or a cyber attack or a solar flare or anything? So because if we go back to the nodes and there's only less than 10 people who have a copy of that currency, the ledger of this currency, it would be gone. It'd be wiped for the most part. I can't say for sure, but I think we would have a very hard time recovering who owns what in these units, unless you hold them physically. But if we're talking digitally, it would be very hard to allocate who owns what. With the currency number 2, because there's 20 plus thousand nodes around the world, 20,000 copies of this ledger that gets updated every 10 minutes, we would easily be able to restore that. No problem. And with currency number 2, there's actually a node in outer space. So there's a satellite circulating the Earth that actually has a copy of the currency number 2's ledger, transaction history. So even if everything was wiped off Earth, we would still be able to restore the copy of the transactions, the ledger, essentially. Both would go down, but we would be able to restore currency number 2. How to create a new supply. So with currency number 1, you actually don't need anything. You don't need any energy. You don't need anything. You just kind of press a button on your computer and you can add zeros to it. Or you can print more of it. I guess that uses a little bit of energy, but not many dollars are printed anymore. They're all digitally. With currency number 2, you actually need real life energy if you want to create new coins. Oh, I made it so far into this without saying it. But it actually takes real world energy if you want to create new units of currency number 2. So you need real world energy or electricity if you want to create new units of currency number 2. So that's a big deal. That adds to its scarcity. It makes it a harder currency. And trending, one is trending down in terms of trust, and one is actually trending upwards in terms of adoption and trust by the society. So that's the taste test of currency number 1 and currency number 2. So again, if you just looked at this list objectively, I would predict that about 99% of people, on average, would choose currency number 2. And the people, the 1% who choose currency number 1, are probably the ones who have 30% of the supply of it right now, or they're just very ignorant. So that's the taste test. So let's go down a little bit here. Let's take this a little bit further here. And I just kind of want to exemplify why it's so important and why we should have some sort of urgency right now in terms of acquiring units of currency number 2. So in 2015, 10 years ago today, these sats, these are basically a way to measure currency number 2. So they're fractions of currency number 2. We'll call them sats. So in 2015, you could have traded $1 for 454,000 sats. Fast forward 10 years, 2025, that same $1 will get you 1,029 sats. 10 years. That's how much currency number 1 has decreased in value, in trust, in everything. This is a very big spread here. 10 years ago, you could have got 450,000 units of currency number 1, currency number 2 per dollar. We'll call them Bitcoin now because we know we've kind of passed the taste test. So we'll call it Bitcoin now. In 2015, you could have got 450,000 sats for $1. 10 years later, 1,000. So that's kind of a combination between the Bitcoin network growing, more people adopting it, more people seeing value in it, conviction growing in people's knowledge base. They're less likely to sell, more likely to buy. And so that's what we've kind of seen over these last 10 years is Bitcoin growing, but also the dollar just getting absolutely obliterated. And it's kind of a tale of two sides here, both contributing to this large spread in terms of exchange rates for Bitcoin and US dollars. So let's go to Canada though now, because this is even more scary to me. 10 years ago in Canada here, you could have purchased 361,000 Bitcoin. Sats, sorry, not Bitcoin. You could have purchased 361,000 sats for $1 Canadian 10 years ago. The same Canadian dollar today will get you 721 sats. And if you wanted to buy 450,000, as we kind of alluded to up here, how much would that cost you today? 441 US dollars. So 10 years ago, what you could have purchased with $1 US now costs you 441 US dollars. And you have to keep in mind here that this is, again, this is definitely, we're looking at a 10-year time frame here, and it's really impossible to know what's going to come in the future. Will these numbers fluctuate? Will we change direction? Will the trend continue or not? And we just have to keep in mind here that all this has happened. The sats per dollar going from 450,000 to 1,000, that's all happened with 1% of the population owning Bitcoin. So I think if you ask the average person, they would agree that Bitcoin's probably going to be here for a while. It's probably has some longevity to it. And so if this continues, as long as Bitcoin stays, decentralized, secure, as Jeff Booth says, then this is probably going to continue, because all of these metrics, all of these returns, everything that I've shown you so far has been based on 1% of the population adopting Bitcoin, which means that there's still 99% of the population who's got to show up here. And over these next couple of months, we're going to see states, US states buying Bitcoin. We're going to see countries buying Bitcoin. We're going to see more public companies continuing to add Bitcoin to their balance sheets, and possibly the most influential government and country in the world buying Bitcoin. So when those things happen, the amount of sats per dollar is just going to keep going down and down and down to scary amounts. Then it becomes equal. 1 sat equals $1. And then you're going to have to start paying more dollars for half a sat or a quarter of a sat. That's where we're trending to here. And so the longer you wait to adopt this and understand it and just get some skin in the game here, the less sats and the less piece of digital scarcity here you're going to end up with. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you enjoy that. It's really interesting to me to look at this stuff very objectively. And that's why I like using the currency 1 and 2. Because again, people just carry around this negativity around Bitcoin just when they hear it. Their brain just shuts off. They don't understand it. They've heard some bad things about it. They've spent 0 hours actually learning about it. And so that's kind of the opinions that they form, is based on this negative 16 years of negative marketing against Bitcoin. So actionable item, get as much Bitcoin as you possibly can, because this is just going to continue. The gap is going to continue to widen here. So take a sip, currency number 2, and then buy a bunch of as many liters of it as you can get. So I hope you enjoy that. I hope you have a great day today, and we'll catch you on the next one.